Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Inquirer Live. My name is Ray Boyd. I'm the Deputy Editor for Audience Development here at the Philadelphia Inquirer. Today, I'm so excited to be joined by three of the newest members of the Inquirer's Board of Directors to talk about digital transformation that's taking place here, but also throughout our industry. Considering the role that digital transformation has played in all of our guests' individual careers, we're going to discuss how it might impact the Inquirer's evolution as we continue to grow and serve readers across the Philadelphia region. I'm excited to get to hear how the new board members' knowledge and experience may impact our organization and its future moving forward. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping details. A few things to know. At any time during the discussion, you'll have the opportunity to submit questions for our guests. To do so, all you have to do is ask your questions in the comments section at the bottom of this page. If you're watching us on Facebook or YouTube, please join us for the Q&A at inquirer.com/digital-live. You can submit your questions there. I promise I won't hog our guests too much. As time allows, we will address as many questions as possible during that Q&A session at the end of our conversation. So without further ado, let's get to it. Our first guest, Mitra Kalita, joined the Inquirer board in November. She's an award-winning journalist, an author, a founding editor, a former nonprofit president, and an adjunct professor. She recently served as the vice president at CNN Digital. She left CNN after the 2020 election to launch a series of community media ventures. She is the CEO of URL Media, a network of Black and Brown brands trying to work together for broader reach and revenue. She also launched Epicenter NYC, a newsletter to help New Yorkers get through the pandemic, and runs newsletters on education and real estate as well. Her career has also included stops at the Los Angeles Times, where she served as managing editor, Quartz, Mint, the Washington Post, Newsday, and the Associated Press. She joins the Inquirer board and will help to, as she puts it, advance its growth through platforms and products that serve many communities. Mitra, welcome.
Hi, Ray. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Thank you so much for being here. Our next guest, Gillian White, she joined the Inquirer board as well in November. She's a managing editor at The Atlantic, where she's worked since 2014 and leads their special projects team. She also leads its podcast and its editorial events group. Gillian is no stranger to Philadelphia. She spent her teenage years in nearby Mount Holly and credits the Inquirer with inspiring her to pursue a career in journalism. Before joining The Atlantic, Gillian covered economics, financial services, housing, and retail for Kiplinger. Her work also appeared in publications such as the New York Times, Bloomberg, and MarketWatch. Welcome, Gillian.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for taking the time to be with us. And finally, Neil Vogel joined the Inquirer board back in April. He's the chief executive at DotDash, formerly known as Aboutcom. Its publishing brands include Very Well, Investopedia, The Spruce, Serious Eats, Simply Recipes, and Birdie. And Neil is also a Lower Moreland grad. He earned a bachelor's degree in finance from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. And his service on the Inquirer board is somewhat of a thank you to the Inquirer, as he credits the paper's sports section with essentially teaching him how to read. Neil, I share that with you as well. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, guys. Nice to see everyone.
So once again, thank you all for taking the time to be here. I'm really excited to have this conversation. And I kind of wanted to start today's chat by sort of defining for our audience what digital transformation for media organizations really means. I feel like digital transformation is somewhat of this all-encompassing term, but one thing that I think every media outlet has sort of grappled with in some form. So I'll ask all of you, and maybe we'll start with Mitra and kind of work our way around. What does digital transformation mean to you when you hear that phrase? How would you define it?
I mean, I'm kind of tempted to start with this is a phone, because, and I say it half jokingly, because the other half is that if you think about what digital transformation means for a Philadelphia Inquirer versus, which is a storied institution, right? versus a brand like Epicenter, around since July as an email newsletter, digital transformation is of equal importance to our organizations, and yet our approaches will be very different, right? And what we're leaning into will be very different. So I hesitate to kind of give one answer for every media outlet within this, but the reason I say I'm only half joking about the phone is because for me, digital transformation is really about meeting users where they are and on their terms as much as possible. And so the reason I show the phone is because, you know, for the sports section that you and Neil grew up reading, right? Even that experience of how you consume that information has been transformed 10 years, 10 months, and we hit a pandemic. And so I think the digital piece is kind of a catch-all when the reality is it's changing every day, right? My relationship with my phone in the last 9 months has been transformed, right? Like this phone that I just showed you no longer has my wallet, keys, and like everything stuffed into it like it did when I used to go to work, had to run to a kid's school meeting, had to go to the store, had to figure out how to eat lunch somewhere in there, right? Like that's transformation. So I really do see this as keeping up with our users and the times that we're in.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting, and I kind of want to get all of your takes on that. Gillian, what do you think about when you hear digital transformation and media organizations sort of trying to adapt?
Yeah, Mitra stole the phrase kind of right out of my mouth. I think it's about meeting users where they are, and where they are in large part is on their phones, on their computers, listening to things, reading things. That is where they are. And what I think the transformation part of it is asking media companies, asking the Inquirer, asking magazines, asking the radio, everyone to meet people where they are actually listening, reading, and consuming news and stories and entertainment. And I think that is ever changing and ever evolving. You know, if we had this conversation 15, 20 years ago, podcast wouldn't have been a part of that equation, but you know, the websites and the burgeoning internet might have been in a different capacity. You know, the way that I consume news has vastly changed in the present day than what it was when I was in high school and I would, you know, read the newspaper and watch the nightly news. So I think when you say digital transformation, it's thinking about both where your readers are right now and also where they're going in the future, and how technology is evolving and how that influences our everyday lives. And thinking about kind of the day-to-day tick-tock of how things change. You know, Mitra mentioned the fact that she's no longer shoving everything into a phone kind of wallet case to get to work. But I think it's also true, you know, thinking about how people are taking public transportation or not, thinking about, you know, moments like this, a pandemic, where all of a sudden people who perhaps were listening to podcasts on their commute all of a sudden don't have that commute. So how are you reaching people? Where are they spending all of their time? Perhaps now they're spending an additional 2 hours a day looking at their computer on Zoom or getting push notifications on their phone. And that is how they're keeping up with what's happening in the election or something like that. So I think it's both thinking about kind of what is the broad way that people are consuming stories and news, and also then thinking about how that is ever evolving and how that can change and how you can be at the forefront of that and make sure that people are going to you for their stories and making sure that you're getting critical information, especially for someplace like the Philadelphia Inquirer, especially for local news organizations, that you are finding people and getting them the information they need to make decisions in their everyday life.
Yeah, and I think that point is really interesting about sort of the Philadelphia Inquirer and other local news organizations, and the way that the conversations may be different depending on the type of organization you are. And that's definitely something I want to touch on throughout our conversation. Neil, I was interested to get your thoughts as well.
I'll say something a little bit different. I think I'm going to say something that's going to sound not make any sense, but it'll make sense in a second. I actually don't think digital transformation is that hard. What's really hard is figuring out like your reason to exist and your place in the universe. And if you can figure out as a media company why you exist, the digital part gets easier, because then you know with all these different platforms and tools, you'll know how to use them. So like when you look at something like the Inquirer's value is not that it's this printed thing dropped on people's doorstep. The The value is the information is trusted, beloved, needed by people to make their lives better, to get through the day, whether it's sports or whether it's government or whether it's news or whatever it is. If the Inquirer can figure out what its true value is to the community, where do I eat? What do the Eagles do with their new coach? I don't understand. Like, if you can get the value down into a nugget, then it's easier to figure out what to do with that nugget on Twitter or on Facebook, or how you're going to make your website look, or how you're going to make your app look, or how you're going to deliver information to people, or how you're going to sell ads. And so the hardest part of digital transformation is it makes people take a hard look at their own businesses. And the guys that fail are the ones that don't really understand what they're doing. And one of the interesting things that's been really fun for me here is it feels like the Inquirer understands what they're doing now. Now we just have to take that understanding and figure out how to use all these new tools.
And Neil, you sort of touched on what I want to segue into next, which is what about the Inquirer sort of attracted all of you to the board, and what do you hope to bring as it's taking those steps and making sort of that ongoing digital transformation? I guess we'll kick it to you, and then we can kind of.
I mean, look, Philadelphia is one of the great American cities, and the role of trusted local news and information is invaluable in a democracy, just as it is to a sports fan. And the whole reason I got involved, A, was I was like unbelievably flattered that everybody asked, but B, to the extent that we can help create, with the unique structure that the Inquirer lives in, which I'm sure we're going to talk about, a sustainable vehicle for high quality, really reputable local information is about as worthwhile of an endeavor as I think you could possibly spend your time on.
And Gillian, would you like to expand as well of sort of what stood out for you about the Inquirer, joining the board, some of your hopes as you help the company moving forward?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I have been reading the Inquirer since I was a tween, if that's still a thing, teenager. It's one of the reasons that I even considered a career in journalism. But before my career in journalism, I actually was in finance. And the thing that drew me to the Inquirer was kind of the same thing that has drawn me to my role at the Atlantic, which is thinking about, and this, kind of dovetails with what Neil just said, thinking about the importance of journalism, thinking about the importance of news. And I spent so much time seeing this industry that I love and this industry that I think is so important and so vital, just kind of hit the skids a little bit and worrying about what that meant for our country, what that meant for, as Neil said, democracy, what it means in general to have kind of a free, fair press threatened, and to have people not able to get information. I think it's critical for local news organizations who were kind of hit the hardest, to be able to reach their readers and for people to have knowledge about what's going on in their community, in their city. So for me, the ability to come to the board and to be able to take what I've learned from the Atlantic and elsewhere and finance and all of those places and combine them and think about what the future of the Inquirer looks like in a city that I love, Philly, where I spent many of my teen years, and where many of my very close friends live, and be able to help such a great and storied news organization kind of figure out what they look like for the next 5, 10, 15, et cetera years. I mean, how do you pass that up?
And Mitra, I'd love to get your thoughts on that as well.
So I don't have the Philly cred of either of these two, but I will tell you, I was raised in Puerto Rico, and my parents came back to the mainland for my brother to finish high school and for me to start middle school. And my father worked in New York City, and they chose this growing, once cornfield suburban town called West Windsor. And they specifically chose it because it was equidistant between New York and Philadelphia, which is like a very immigrant mindset of, if I lose my job in New York, at least I could commute to Philadelphia if I had to find something else. And so, so Philadelphia is definitely a part of my teenage years too. Having taken many a SEPTA in to like escape the suburbs of New Jersey. And I thank the city for that. On a more serious note, you mentioned I was the managing editor of the LA Times, and I emerged from that short experience. I was only there for 14 months, but there were 3 publishers in that short time frame, which gives you a sense of the rocky ownership of local media in America. And I emerged with two lessons. One was I can fight the ownership of an outlet and convince them of the right thing to do. And I can not fight, but work with the newsroom, speaking of digital transformation, and get them on board with the right thing to do in terms of meeting users where they are and some of the themes we've talked about. I can't do both of those things at the same time. And so when I got the call about possibly serving on the board of the Inquirer, I had already been following the journey of this paper in terms of ownership with a lot of interest, right? Because there's, admittedly a test going on right now in Philadelphia of could this model be the right one, right? It's not a billionaire owner that might have a stake in the sports team and his or her own interests at stake, or owns half the town as some other outlets we've seen, right? It's not a nonprofit that might have kind of its own set of financial models and funding that are sometimes at odds with proving a market, tracking the metrics of a place, subscription models, right? So I really saw this as an opportunity to be up close in not just this laboratory, because I don't want to make it sound like this is not kind of this experiment, like this has to work, right? As an institution and turning this around, like this really has to work, because what happens here might be able to be duplicated in other cities. It might have implications for outlets like me, like a small email newsletter that in the absence of government help in the epicenter of the epicenter here in Queens, set ourselves up so that you might know what to do if, God forbid, someone in your family dies of COVID and you have to get the body from the city morgue. I mean, that's like the level of service that I think journalists have encountered over the last year and what we need to be to people. And so for me, there was almost this element of, look, I just left working for the biggest brand, arguably on the planet at CNN, and launching this small newsletter, but that really aims to kind of help users with these life and death situations. And I just thought this was such an opportunity to learn and to possibly give back what I'm seeing from both of those experiences in my career.
And Mitra, I kind of wanted to stick with you on a point that you had just mentioned with benefiting audiences as well, and sort of the cross section between digital transformation and confronting diversity, which has sort of been at the center of a lot of the storylines that defined 2020. And I especially wanted to bring this up in light of your newest media venture, which was announced this week. So I'd love if you could kind of tell our guests a little bit about that venture, and sort of that mission of serving diverse audiences and also making that digital transformation. I'd just love for you to expand on that.
Sure. Thank you. So on Monday, we announced the creation of URL Media, and URL stands for not what you think it might stand for. It's uplift, respect, and love. And that framework, my co-founder is a woman who some of the folks joining us today might know, because she's definitely from Philly, Sarah Lomax-Reese, who's the president of WURD, the Black Talk radio station in Philadelphia. And I'll give you the backstory. Sarah runs a radio station where they put out news and information, and people call them all day long and tell them how they're feeling, right? I, at the time that we met, was working at CNN, which had reach and revenue, but was trying to figure out how to start verticals and kind of go narrower, and to some of what we're talking about, like how do you make yourself relevant in people's lives and go from a strategy of covering everything to getting more specific. And of course, like many national media outlets, we also strived for authenticity, intimacy in our coverage, and engagement. And so when I met Sarah, I was like, you mean people call you all day long and just tell you what they're thinking? That's amazing, right? And so we each realized that we kind of had what the other needed. And so URL is its inaugural group is just 8 brands with an eye towards bringing in more. They're all Black and brown owned, led, and predominantly serving those audiences. So Epicenter, the newsletter that I founded, is also a member. I kind of feel like the hair club president for men, where I'm like a member and the president, or the client and the president. And our intention is to let these outlets, like what I think we all do best is serve communities, right? We are rooted in some cases, geographic communities, in other cases, identity. And in some, like as in Sarah's case, the overlapping, right? Philadelphia's Black community has a place that exists to uplift, respect, and love these users. We believe that by working together, both in terms of sharing content, but sharing each other's distribution channels, we are able to achieve scale in a way that's very difficult if you're just coming out of the gate and you're a newsletter of a few thousand subscribers. They love you. Your open rates might be huge, and yet you're still going to be fighting the Goliath of Google, of the New York Times, of kind of some of the other brands that we've mentioned. So how can we work together to achieve that? Just kind of for perspective's sake, on Facebook, if you combined our brands, we already have 6 million users. So being able to start a company with that type of a base where we can leverage each other just puts us, we think, that much further ahead, both from distribution, which is a really important part of the game, and then also subsequently for advertising, possible syndication, and admittedly many, many other projects in development.
Nice. Well, I was very, very excited when I saw the announcement about URL Media, and I'll be definitely following along closely.
Thank you.
To see what ends up happening from here. Neil, I kind of want to pivot and turn the next question to you. Considering the mission at DotDash with the brands that are underneath that umbrella, helping people really answer specific questions, solving different problems that are very focused and relatable. What's sort of the approach to serving audiences with those brands? Is there any sort of a translation between what those brands do, what a local news outlet like the Inquirer?
Yeah, I think there's things. We're for those who don't know, DotDash, we're a different kind of publisher. We're what in the industry is called a service publisher. So we're not really news or sports or gossip or celebrity. We're news that helps you, right? We're health, we're finance, we're food, we're beauty and style, we're home, we're why is my router too slow? What's the best way to beer better fry a chicken? I have this feeling, what does it mean? Am I sick or something? And what we've been really good at, and we're now one of the biggest publishers in the country, is across our brands is helping people answer questions, solve problems, learn things, get inspired. And I think a big part of the overlap is defining what the Inquirer should be, which I think Gillian mentioned before. It should be something that helps people. Like the Inquirer should tell you where to eat. It should help you be more healthy. It should understand how to vote in Philadelphia. And a lot of the discipline that we've come up with to make service content really applies to what a news publisher would do. And the second bit of our story, our specific story, is our company now, DotDash, was once Aboutcom, was once owned by the New York Times. And I came in when our parent company, IAC, which is Barry Diller, a big media mogul, bought it, brought me in to run it. And it was fresh out of the New York Times at a time when the New York Times was not particularly great at the internet. They're very good at it now. They weren't then. So sort of like by happenstance, I have a lot of hands-on experience. Sort of, it's like a digital to digital transformation, like digital the first way that maybe wasn't the right way, to digital in a way that can really, really work. And I think what's so appealing and attractive to me about the Inquirer, aside from the structure and all the things people have said, is the ability to redefine what a newspaper, a news source is locally, to broaden it out. It's not just what happened in city government. It's not just what happened in the Sixers game, but to be all of this useful information about Philadelphia and the region and about life and about culture. Like our biggest businesses are health and food and what to do with your home and all these things that we've learned. I think you can incorporate that, particularly because digital is like limitless, in and around the Inquirer, and I think you can have a really big success.
Thank you for that, Neil. And sort of to that point, Gillian, I wanted to bounce a question off of you.
Yeah.
You know, we're sort of living in a time where, and all of us have mentioned sort of different digital transformation things that have changed journalism. There's no shortage of places to turn to where you can get news, you can get information, different brands, different mediums, different deliverables that people are using to consume journalism. In your view, is there anything that a local news outlet like the Inquirer can do in these times to sort of stand out, not just serving readers better, but to actually, I guess, sort of present our mission for why you should choose a local news outlet like this? You know, what are some things that we can do, especially in a time when media organizations are kind of battling some mistrust as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are absolutely things that the Inquirer and that media organizations in general can do to, one, capture readers, two, to carve out a space for themselves, and three, to regain trust. I mean, that's a little bit trickier in these times. But I think the central premise, and Neil has touched on this too, is knowing who you are and what you're trying to do. You cannot be all things to all people, and the Inquirer should not be trying to, nor should any other media organization. And in figuring that out and figuring out who you want to be and what you want, what type of audience you want to serve and how you want to serve them, that helps differentiate you from other people, right? So like at The Atlantic, we are a large, old national magazine. So is New York Mag. People would not necessarily confuse the two of us. We have a different voice. We do different types of stories. We appeal to sometimes a different demographic. So there are ways to carve out a space for yourself. And I think the Inquirer can absolutely do that. And I think it's imperative that it does. I think it's also imperative that the Inquirer kind of finds that voice for itself, because again, local news is so incredibly important. To Neil's point, the idea is to help, and yes, do things like tell people where to eat, tell people, you know, how to make sense of something that happened with the Eagles or the Phillies or something like that. But there are also those really critical day-to-day things, like your local news organization in the time of COVID is going to help you make sense of caseloads, what is happening in your city, what's going on with vaccines, perhaps where you can go to get them. And that is going to be different. What's happening in Philly is different than what's happening in Trenton. And it is critical that the Inquirer has a voice and a connection with the city that it serves and is able to get people the information that they want, but also the information that they need. And I think there are myriad ways to do that, but I think the kind of central thing is to say, who are we? Who are we? What is our tone? What is our voice? Who are we trying to reach? And how will we succeed in doing that? And what do people want from us? And when you do that and you define that and you hit it again and again and again, and you figure out what people need from you and where to meet them, then people trust you. And when you have that kind of North Star and it's constantly guiding you and your coverage wraps around that, I think people understand what to expect. And when you consistently deliver, it helps build that trust.
And I just want to remind everyone, again, thanking our guests for tuning in. If you have any questions for our panelists, feel free to drop them in. If you're on Inquirer Live, if you're on inquirer.com/digital live, you can drop your questions in. If you're on Facebook or YouTube, please come join us there for the conversation and get your questions, and we'll ask some towards the end. Another thing I wanted to pose to all three of you, and we'll start with Mitra and work our way around. 2020 was a rough year as a world, as a society. It was a tough year for journalism as an industry as well. A lot of difficult challenges sort of facing the industry. Do you have any particular hopes for journalism in 2021? Are there potential advancements that really excite you, things that you feel like, despite the difficulties of the previous year, something that kind of makes you excited about the industry moving forward?
Well, as someone who's mentioned community a few times so far in this discussion, I'm I'm really elated at people seeking community out to get through the pandemic, and in many, many forms, right? So, um, and I think this relates directly to the Inquirer, because beyond providing, content and sports scores and kind of, again, like the stuff that's in a paper, um, the ability to serve almost as the glue of a community is one of the most powerful things that journalism represents right now. So for that, I actually am very hopeful. And I think that people across the country recognize that much of the last few years and the divisions were such a reflection of that lack of community. And that we kind of thought by being more connected digitally that we were really connected, but we really were not connected. And there's nothing like being told you can't go anywhere but a 10-block radius around you to start to ask yourself those kind of, to Neil's point, the existential questions about why am I here? Who do I serve? How do I want to raise my children? Should I be more involved in, like, I don't know that 87-year-old's name and I see her all the time. Or maybe she's now shut in and we should be helping her. So I think the existential nature of what this country and communities are going through have massive implications for journalism. And in so many ways, both URL Media and Epicenter are direct outcomes of wanting to serve and, almost create news that has action. Because I think we've been really good as an industry of pointing out the problems, right? Like, oh, this, vaccines are really screwed up, that rollout. But the people who are turning to you for information right now, I guarantee you their question is, when can I get one? How? And is there some role I can play in my community or in my family to like uplift others? And those are all, to me, while they're massive problems right now, they also represent a shift in our relevance to users.
And I'd love to get all of your thoughts. We also have a couple questions coming in from the audience, so we'll get to those in a few minutes. But I definitely want to all get thoughts from all of you on sort of your hopes for 2020, things that
I got a quick one. I'm actually super optimistic about journalism, and it depends how you define journalism. If you define journalism as super narrow, politics, COVID, you're going to feel really weird because it's a really weird year. But if you zoom out a little bit, digital media and your phone and your computer was the only thing that you had for the last year. And I feel guilty saying this. Our business went bananas. We're up like well beyond expectations. We're like very profitable, like 20, 30% growth in traffic, revenue, everything, because people are now more and more comfortable with the new tools to get information that helps their lives. And the one thing I can't speak about is the thing you're speaking the most about, which is news. And we don't really do news, but we do everything else. And in the opportunity to serve everything else, things look really good. They look really, everyone's cooking at home. Everybody's fixing their own house. You have to entertain your kids. You got to teach your kids at school. You got to fix your own computer. Like all these things that have happened are really good for trusted information sources online. And you see it locally and you see it nationally. We do both. And I'm entering 2021 hopeful, optimistic. So much change was forced upon people in the last 9 months. It's going to really help in the next couple of years. I think the trajectory is good.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. Gillian, I wanted to get your thoughts as well.
Yeah, I was just gonna say 2020 was, a bit of a nightmare of a year. And it was a really noisy year. And it did actually make me fairly optimistic about journalism, because I think it also reminded people the importance of journalism versus people spewing random things on the internet and on Facebook. The importance of having organizations that you trust and who are transparent about the ways in which they gather information and disseminate it. And I think people were reminded very broadly how important that is. And I think people came to journalism for two things. One was help, and that is everything from, how do I understand what coronavirus is, to how do I cook this meal? I'm stuck at home, to how do I how do I put together a home office, right? All of those things were in the wheelhouse of what journalists were doing, and also escape. A lot of like big feature stories that were enticing, that had twists and turns. There was a period there where Netflix only has so much on it, as does Hulu and everything else. Sometimes people wanted to read something, they wanted escape, but they didn't necessarily want to read an entire book. So, what we saw was that like we have kind of these two sides of the journalism that we do. One is kind of newsier, this is what's happening, big step backs. This is how to make sense of this policy that just happened. And then there's the other side, these big deep dive narrative features. And both of those did really well. And I think people were really reminded of the importance of journalism and storytelling and all of those things. And my hope is that that momentum continues, and that people are reminded that this isn't just important during, a once in a generation pandemic. This is important every single day.
Yeah, I definitely think that that's something that 2020 tested us in doing, is sort of managing big picture stuff and day-to-day stuff all at the same time. There were certainly a lot of challenges. One question that we have coming in from the audience, Mitra, this is for you. How do you hope to position URL as a more inclusive and community-focused network than, say, other newsletter platforms that sort of currently exist?
So we're not just a newsletter, right? We're launching on social and newsletter in these early weeks with an eye towards kind of seeing what content resonates. But I think that there's a few ways. So one of our partners is Scrollstack, which is actually publisher and platform. And I say this because as soon as we went public on Monday with a soft launch, it was like the floodgates had opened, and suddenly everyone was like, Black and Brown media, we've been waiting for you our whole lives, right? So that was like one reaction, which was wonderfully redeeming. Another reaction, which I'm equally excited about, was from the creators who you're not hearing about on Substack. A woman who emails me and says, I'm a retired Detroit public school principal. I run a weekly radio program on Sundays, and I would love to be a part of this because I don't know how to make ends meet anymore. I give tips on schools. I play some music. It's like kind of this like hodgepodge, right? And you guys know exactly who I'm talking about, because every community has these personalities, right? Who are part content creators, part glue of the community. But like when you need to get your kid into school, this is the person you're calling, right? And so I said to her, I said, if I were you, I'd get on Scrollstack, because it's an easy way for us to start including you in our network, right? This is a platform that's very open, and it's global. You can publish in Hindi, Bengali, Spanish. Their Spanish efforts are getting really big, and also has multiple currencies when it comes to micro. I mean, we're open, but I just want to mention that it's very global in its outlook. And so one way just instantly to be inclusive is to remember that for us, local communities can also be global communities, right? And so the Bangladeshis here in Queens might have more in common with folks on Brick Lane in London than they do with some folks in Philadelphia or in New Jersey. And because, our connections to each other span through identity. And so I think the inclusivity is built into some of our partners. I also welcome hearing from any. I mean, what's been just wonderful to hear is also how a network like this can make the intersectional feel very seen. So Afro-Latino users are saying, well, this is great because there's a few platforms here that serve me. And I think that is, there's something about that too that's like very futuristic and kind of a next generation that's more comfortable with overlapping identity as opposed to just you are this thing and this thing only.
And we have a couple more questions too. I'll try to run through a couple of these quick with the time we have left. Gillian, I'd love to get your thoughts on this one. one of the guests asked, we've raised a generation to think that news deserves to be free. How do you meet the consumer where they are and get them to pay?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is tricky, and it really depends on the organization and the model that they're seeking. For some, free is the right model. For some people, they are not trying to put their content behind a paywall, and the ways that they're trying to engage and get money or get revenue are different, are via advertisers, and the goal is to get as many people flooding into the website or the page as humanly possible, and then make money off of ad dollars. For other folks, the Atlantic included, it takes us so long and so much effort to put together stories. I think especially when you're doing deep reporting, and reporting is kind of core to the work that you're doing, especially stuff that is time consuming, that is resource intensive. What you really want to do is be in a very deep relationship with your readers, and for your readers to be the people who are at the end of the day supporting you, and paying the bills and keeping the lights on, because you know that what you have control over that direct relationship. You give them really good stories, you give them really good journalism, you do your best work, it's rewarded through subscriptions, and it becomes what you hope is a virtuous cycle. I think it's a mind shift. I think it is a huge mind shift that has to happen. And I think it's part of what got messy in the early days of writing on the internet, right? People, myself included, came up during a time in my late teens and early 20s were a time where everything on the internet for the most part was free. And my expectation was to be able to go read something whenever I wanted for free. And now that is less so. Like I have an understanding that news organizations have to employ people, they have to pay their bills, reporting takes money. And if I want to read really good journalism that I trust and that is entertaining and that is well done, yeah, I might have to pay some money for it in order to keep it going. Otherwise, a lot of those places have and will shutter. So I think it's been a slow shift. I think people are kind of coming into that realization on their own. But I think in terms of how media organizations deal with it, it really depends on your organization. It depends on what your revenue model is and what you're trying to do and what is best kind of for your company.
And Neil, I'd actually like to get your thoughts on this as well, because you sort of mentioned how, in a way, 2020 also provided those opportunities for some growth to bring readers in around some specific problems that they had. I'd love to get your thoughts on that as well, around getting people to come, getting them to pay and see the value.
Sure. I mean, I would say there's different models, and I would say if you want someone to pay for something, make it worth paying for. It's a lot of the stuff is relatively simple. Like the New York Times has done an unbelievable job of getting people to pay for things. Their food business is great. People pay for it. Like their crosswords, people love, they pay for it. The paper, people pay for it. Like the Washington Post, people pay for it. And so what Gillian said, the expectation that everything is free, I think is changing in some ways. And you even see it in sports with something like The Athletic. Like people are willing to pay for things they deem special. Now, saying that, we don't have any pay sites, right? We've got 25 domains and 13 brands, and we don't charge anyone. And I think that's because our model is different. Like we're big enough at scale that advertising in a super respectful way works for us. And we also do a lot of helping people make decisions, right? Like if we help you decide what blender you're going to use in your kitchen, we'll get paid for that. If we help you decide with a great editorial integrity what credit card you should sign up for, and you sign up, we get paid for that. So in our model, because we do 14 or 15 million user sessions a day, and it's very intent driven. People, exactly what they want because they're trying to solve problems. That's a very valuable traffic to sell ads against and to do transactional stuff. If you're more general news, like the Inquirer or like the Times or like the Post, you have to do that really, really, really well so people are willing to pay for it, because it's a very different proposition from the advertiser side, right? Much harder to target against news, and you're not going to have some of the transactional opportunities that we have. But I view that as more clarifying than anything. It just says that if you're going to be the Inquirer in this market, you need to be the leader in this market, and you need to focus on the things that people want from you. Maybe it's sports, maybe it's food, maybe it's local politics, maybe it's travel, maybe it's something else. And you're going to have to put together the little alchemy that works for you that's going to make people pay. And here's the thing with the Inquirer, like people have been paying to have the Inquirer delivered to their doorstep for what, 100 and however many years. The leap isn't that big to take. It's not that big to take. And the opportunity the internet and all these platforms afford you is for such a better experience and so much more value for a similar or even lower price. I think the opportunity to convince people to pay is like right in front of us.
And I think that sort of works so parallel with the idea of why digital transformation is so vital to media organizations. Another question, Mitra, that I wanted to ask you, are there sort of, as you're building up this new venture, you've worked with legacy brands before, are there traps that you've seen along the way that media companies sort of fall into when they're trying to go through this evolution of figuring out who they are, who are we supposed to serve, sort of answering these sort of big questions that we've posed in this conversation?
Yeah, I think there's something called shiny object syndrome where like everybody chases the thing, but especially for large legacy organizations, by the time you catch up to the trend, you've probably had, I don't know, 20 committee meetings, you've had a few memos go around, and that thing has then graduated to whatever the next thing is, right? And I've seen this, it's not, my last employer was CNN, but I promise you I've seen this for a big chunk of my career. So it's not just CNN. So I think that's just one risk that we run in the game of catch up versus what I think Neil was alluding to when we began the conversation of, who are we and who are we trying to serve, right? The mission of a company matters so much as you're trying to determine the path ahead versus constantly looking in the rearview mirror like, oh, everyone's doing podcasts, we got to do a podcast, right? Instead of stopping and saying, well, what would Philadelphians actually want to listen to? And we sometimes skip over that obvious question. And I say we kind of in a traditional media sense. And then the other thing I would just say is that the ground is shifting beneath our feet around workers and staff and what they represent in a company. And some of that has been forced just by kind of literally where we're working, what's the culture that we're creating. But, I'm very guided by lessons from the last year, both the pandemic and the killing of George Floyd, and these two things kind of coming together and saying, listen, is there another way that we want employees to feel a part of something, right? How do we make this mission as important to their sense of purpose as just do the thing I'm telling you, here's your paycheck and let's move on, right? I think that, and I we're journalists, like we really all got into it for the mission. The purpose really binds us, but I think that's just an area that I'm really trying to pay closer attention to than in any previous job I've ever held.
And you touched on 2020, and I want to transition into really my last question for all three of you, and we'll go around. But before I do that, I want to thank all the people in the audience who have been joining us for this conversation. Thank you for all of your questions. This has been a really enlightening chat for me. I think the last year clearly has challenged newsrooms and the journalism industry in a lot of different ways. We've talked about how the pandemic has changed workflows. It's impacted finances. The country's going through this long overdue racial reckoning, I think, that has forced our industry to kind of do the same. And we've seen instances of that at different outlets. Just a few weeks ago, we reported on an attack on the Capitol, and the country's democracy really as a whole. Are there any sort of words that you would offer to journalists who have come through 2020, the early part of 2021, the challenges, the stories they've had to tell, and who are maybe just simply tired and need a boost or some encouragement? Are there, what are some words that you would kind of share with journalists who are really still in that sort of go mode around all of these really heavy stories. Gillian, we'll start with you and kind of just like work around the group.
Yeah, I mean, I am actively in the newsroom and have, covered the last administration as a reporter and an editor, and I'm still like pretty actively in the newsroom and doing all of those things. So I understand the exhaustion very well. And I think the answer is in part, hang in there, in part, be sure to take the time to do the things that you need to do to keep you sane. But I mean, I will steal some words from our editor-in-chief, which is, and the thing that's heartened me for kind of all of these times is this is what we're here for. This is what we were made for. This is what you get into journalism for, to be here at these historic moments, to, tell the truth, to do the reporting, to be out there. And it is exhausting and it is tiring, but it is our purpose. It is the thing that we were called to do. And these are the times that like truly, truly matter. And these are the stories that truly, truly matter. So I say that because I don't think there's any solve for the exhaustion, really. I remain exhausted too. But that has always kind of kept me going. The fact that, these times are the exact times that journalists and journalism organizations are here to bear witness to, and our readers are counting on us. And I don't think it is too kind of highfalutin or self-important to say that the country and democracy is counting on us and counting on journalists to be there and to get the story right.
Neil, I'd love to hear from you on that as well.
I mean, I am never been a journalist. I'm not a journalist. I've always been like an internet person and a media person, and definitely on the business side of things. And so I can't possibly understand what like a journalist would have gone through the last 4 years. I know what I went through as a very engaged observer, and it was unpleasant. So I imagine being a journalist would have been hard. But I would say that as someone who's very focused on the business of media and the business of online media and the business of publishing, business of news and newspapers, I would say that there's optimism. I feel like there's optimism that business models and organizational structures are being tested and created now that will support your work. And if journalists working this hard only to see newsrooms shrink and to see desks shrink and to see all these changes happen, it's why I got involved with the Inquirer, not just because I love Philadelphia, but because I think that if a business model that works will help solve a lot of these problems. And if my time and effort and like, again, I use the word optimism again. Optimism again is pointed towards there's models that really work, and there's more of them than people think. And there's a lot of talk about what's not working, but not a lot of talk about what is working. Like New York Times is working. Washington Post is working. There's lessons there. DotDash is working. There's a whole bunch of other publishers like us that are working. There are lessons. And if we can piece all those things together for the Inquirer, journalism has a very bright future. And that's what I would say.
Thank you for that, Neil. And Mitra, I'll give you sort of a word on that.
A lot of pressure. I do think that journalists need to listen to that piece of exhaustion and just know when to step away and, not be so heroic about the work, but to actually literally step away. I think that is, and then I'll talk out of the other side of my mouth, which is, as journalists, we can often feel like our work is enough of service to the community. And the truth is that it's not, because it's still often at a distance, especially for national outlets. Like, you're on Twitter all day, congratulations. Or you captured another fight on Twitter all day and wrote about it, congratulations, right? But what I would say that the pandemic allows us to do is to narrow that distance between us and the people around us. And so I would say, it's in your loneliest times that you need to pick up the phone and reach out. It's in those same moments that you say, let me call my 87-year-old neighbor and say, hey, did you get vaccinated yet? Because this system can be really hard to figure out. And I, as the digital transformation guru at insert media outlet here, might be able to hit refresh enough times and get you in there, which is basically how I've been spending my week. And it's in that process. It's kind of like, you know, it's like that shift in from when you're a kid and you love getting gifts to when you enter adulthood and you actually realize it's so much more rewarding to give gifts, right? And I think journalists, if we could kind of start that transition into the latter of service and narrowing our distance from users and humans, I think it would do a lot of good for both sides of that equation right now.
That's fantastic. I want to thank all of you for your time, for all of these amazing insights and nuggets about our industry. I'm excited to have all three of you on the Inquirer's board. So I hope for more conversations moving forward. And I want to thank all of you in the audience for joining today's conversation. And thank you again to each of our guests. We hope you enjoyed the chat. On behalf of the Philadelphia Inquirer, again, my name is Ray Boyd, Deputy Editor for Audience Development here. And we hope you had a wonderful afternoon with us. We'll see you next time on Inquirer Live.
Thank you.